Hello, lovely members. Thank you for joining me again for another evening. Tonight's going to be really, really good. We have got Andrew McCarthy, and he is going to do a presentation on wildlife. Before we start, wildlife photography. Before we start, where are you calling from? We've already got someone. Stuart's here from New Zealand having a cup of tea. He was saying there was someone from Great Dunmow, which is just down the road. So this is like two ends of the earth already in the house. So where are you calling from? Watching from South Wales, Durham City. Anyone from the US tonight? I can't see anyone. Oh, California. Howard from California. Welcome. And lovely to see you all once again. Classic album there. I can't even remember if I've actually put that one on before, right? But let's see who is the first person to get that. And while you're doing that, I am going to tell you about what's going to happen tonight. So yes, we've got Andrew McCarthy. He's going to do a presentation called An Introduction to Wildlife Photography. Now, Andrew's a fantastic photographer, a wealth of knowledge that he's going to share with you tonight. The presentation is going to be around about an hour long, with some questions at the end. If you've got questions that are relevant to what's being said as we go, then please ask them. Don't forget that we are about 30 seconds behind, so you type them in and we don't see them for about 20-30 seconds. But if they're relevant, ask them and we'll answer them, or Andrew will answer them as we go. But if not, we'll just save them for the end, for the live Q&A at the end. And Stuart's cracked it. I don't know if he was the first one to get it. Oh, no, he hasn't actually got it. Oh, he's got the bat right. You haven't got... Right, Stuart, you've got half a point for that. Half a point. You haven't actually got it. Right, listen. That's it. Let's bring Andrew into the mix. Here he is.
Hi, everybody.
Andrew.
Good to see you.
Hello. And thanks for joining us. Andrew,
I got half a point, didn't I, for getting the band, but I didn't get the album.
Yes, you got half a point. No one's actually got the... Well, not that I've seen it there. You got the band. Stuart there got the band, but no one's got the album yet. But there we go. We've got all evening. Let's see what happens. Andrew, thanks for joining us. Really looking forward to tonight. And just introduce yourself, and then I'm going to put up your slide, and then... Oh, sorry, just before. He's got it. He's got it. And so is... Oh, but Anna got in there first, though, Stuart. So Anna's got half a point. Stuart, you've got the other half a point. There you go. There's that. Right. Here we go. I'm going to put your presentation up, Andrew, and I'm going to, let you introduce yourself, and it's over to you.
Great. Well, my name is Andrew McCarthy. I am... Oh, I've just managed to... Hang on a second. I'm not seeing this full screen. That didn't last long, did it?
We've got it full screen. Don't worry.
I've got it full screen now. I like to see it full screen. Yeah, my name's Andrew McCarthy. I'm a fellow of the Royal Photographic Society, OM System Ambassador since 2018, and I was calculating the other day how many years I've been taking pictures, and it's frighteningly long. It's about, I think it's coming up 50 years this year, which is really scary. But wildlife photography since 03, so 03, 04, really once I kicked off my digital career. So based in the southwest of the UK, travelled in most parts of the world, though most of the shots tonight are going to be UK based. So I'm familiar with some of the places that some of our lovely participants are from, including New Zealand and the US. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm just putting, for everyone that's watching, across your screen now is Andrew's details, website, Facebook, and Instagram. If you want to go and follow Andrew, that's his details there.
Thank you.
Sorry, Andrew, after you. Yep.
Okay. Do you need any more information from me? When am I kicking off?
You're kicking off. Let's go.
Okay, great, good. Right. So, introduction to wildlife photography. I've just basically said this, but this is my website. I'm based down in the sunny southwest of the UK, in the far southwest, in a place called Exeter in Devon, and it's a fairly rural county, so lots of opportunities for wildlife photography. And many of the images you're going to see tonight were taken, within a few miles of my home. I don't travel a massive amount for my wildlife photography, and I'll explain why as we move through. So let's kick off. Now, because it's an introduction to wildlife photography, I'm assuming that many of you are either just dipping your toes in the water or maybe thinking about doing it and coming from other genres. And I'll assume as well that you guys have all got a reasonable amount of photographic knowledge, in that you understand the basics, what's meant by shutter speed and aperture and ISO and so on. So I'm going to be using these kinds of phrases. We don't have time tonight, unfortunately, to go into a great deal of technical detail. Because this is an introduction, but yeah, I'll explain things as I go. If anybody really needs to ask, then feel free to fire away. So the problem with wildlife photography very often is what and where to shoot. And I think when you're starting out, this is kind of stuff that I wish I knew 20 years ago, really. What to shoot? Well, there's such a huge variety that I guess it's probably possible to get a little bit bamboozled, really, by the opportunities. Do you go and shoot the big stuff, the deer, or travel abroad or whatever? And if you're shooting in your own country, where do you go to find these subjects? If you're not an ecologist, and I'm a professional ecologist as well as being a nature photographer, it can seem very daunting. Added to that, obviously, we've got quite a lot of specialist equipment, particularly once you get into macro, or if you start shooting and doing mad things like shooting at night. And then you've got very specific settings and camera setups, and this can all seem quite overwhelming, as I say. Added to that is the often, when you're starting out, the lack or sometimes complete absence of field craft. Now, I'm, as I said, a professional ecologist, so I've been lucky enough to work with wildlife on a professional basis for over 30 years, and so I have a reasonable amount or affinity with many wildlife species, and as a consequence of that, I guess my field craft is pretty good, really. That said, it's a problem that many people have when they start out. They don't know how to get close to the species they want to photograph. So that's something we'll be looking at. Obviously, we've got lighting and compositional issues, and I often relate this to portrait photography. If you've got a portrait photographer, that portrait photographer is, presumably got a studio if they're doing an indoor shoot, and they've got their model booked, and the model comes in, and you can position the model, providing they're cooperative. You can put the model in front of your backdrop, and you can adjust your lighting, your studio lighting, and you can fire away. And if you've got a decent model, you'd hope you get some decent shots. Well, wildlife photography is kind of a bit like that, except that very often you can't find the lighting or make it work, and the model doesn't show up. Very often the model doesn't show up, actually, and as a consequence of that, you've got some problems with potential motivational issues. The other thing I would say, and we're going to be talking about this a little bit tonight, and I want to keep coming back to this, is because wildlife photography now is way, way, way more popular than when I started out, which is, as I say, in 03, 04. And going back, many of my colleagues go back, some years before that, to the days of film. And over the last few years, particularly since the advent of social media, environmental considerations are, really high up on the agenda. We are a widely traveled community, us wildlife photographers. Our carbon footprint is pretty big, and the number of shooters in many locations now is causing serious environmental damage. So tonight's talk is going to be looking at all these things, really, and I'm going to be I thought long and hard about how to organize this, but for an hour I thought, well, kind of let's keep it on a discussion basis, and let's bring in these things like field craft issues, lighting and composition, specialist equipment that you might need, or the settings you might need for a particular shot, or some of the things even that are just going through my mind as I'm shooting, on an image by image basis. So I'm going to be structuring this by kicking off just looking at kit first briefly, and then looking at things on a habitat by habitat basis, looking at some of the species we might expect to find in those habitats, and then exploring images that illustrate certain things. So hopefully that's all clear. Just a quick kick-off about equipment. I make no apologies for this. I shoot OM system. I have done since 2018. I used to be a full frame kind of guy. I've had so many cameras and camera systems that I'm slightly embarrassed about it. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I shot Canon for years, and I shot Nikon for a while. I shot Sony for a couple of years. Even a couple of years ago, dipped into Sony while I was waiting for one of the new lenses for OM system to come out. But generally, I've come back to OM system because for me, they pretty much do everything. There's not one system in the world that will do everything that you need it to do. But if you're coming from one of the other genres, maybe portrait or street or landscape, this stuff can all seem a little bit, you're not familiar perhaps with super telephoto lenses. It can seem a little bit expensive and a little bit esoteric. So this is the gear I use. A couple of OM1 bodies, OM1 and OM1 Mark II, and telephotos ranging from the 40-150, and bear in mind there's a 2x crop factor here, so sort of 80 to 300, right up to the 150-400 or an 800mm field of view. I've got a couple of macro lenses, various tripods. I usually take a small tripod in the field with me, particularly if I'm doing macro work, and I'll explain why later. Always have a remote shutter release in the bag, just lives in the bag, in case I decide to do a bit of macro, because the kit's so small that I can keep a 60mm in the bag, even when I'm out shooting birds or something like that. And I usually use a monopod for most of my sort of long lens photography, whether because I'm getting old and starting to get a bit wobbly. I just find it helps me to compose, and I use a gimbal head with it, the Wimberley MH100, which I find really good, really good piece of kit. In terms of setup, pretty simple really. I shoot in manual mode, and I have my ISO setting on auto for the most part. Sometimes vary that if I'm doing macro and need a little bit more control, but generally speaking, manual mode, auto ISO, with shutter speed and aperture adjusted depending on the circumstances, composition, lighting, and so on. And we'll look at some of that as we go through. Now, look, we all know this. You can fast track. If you're getting involved in wildlife photography these days, it's possible to jump into workshops, one-to-ones. There's a huge number now of paid for hides and paid for setups where the wildlife is essentially attracted to you. Some of these are overseas, some of these will be in your own country, but you can pay for fast tracking. And there's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. It's, for many species, it's sometimes the only way you'll see them. A good example in the UK would be kingfishers, where many people have set up hides to attract kingfishers in using live bait, which is another matter, an ethical debate, which probably we haven't got time to discuss. And the birds will come up and perch in front of you, unbeknown to the birds. You're there taking pictures. So they can be very easy places to photograph. And if you want to build up a portfolio quickly, brilliant way of doing it. However, for me, and I'm an antisocial kind of guy, I like being on my own in the wild, and I enjoy finding my own wildlife. And I think whilst obviously we're out there to get photographs, and it's a hugely enjoyable thing to do to make great images, the bottom line is it is far more satisfying to me personally, and to many of my colleagues, to get out in the field and spend a lot of time finding these beasties and getting close. It's a huge thrill, and it beats somebody else having done 95% of the work, because let's face it, if you've got a guaranteed subject in front of you, taking a photograph when the bird or animal doesn't know you're there should be fairly straightforward. If it's a reliable sighting. The problem is the kinds of species that don't lend themselves to that. Now, what I'm going to do, when I started, I found this to be incredibly valuable. and this is something that we can do wherever we are in the world, to shoot local. There's environmental reasons for this. I'm sure we might have differing opinions on it, but I know we'll all be aware of climate change, the need to ideally reduce our carbon footprint. But a great way of doing that is to shoot locally. And what better place to do it if you've got the opportunity and the size of garden is to shoot in your garden. I'll come on to parks in a minute, but gardens are great places to shoot because you can spend short amounts of time there. You can create permanent setups. I haven't got any photographs here of bird photography setups. There's a huge number to give you an idea of what you need to do online. But this is the kind of thing you can get from a simple feeder setup with a nice perch adjacent to it, attracting species such as this greater spotted woodpecker on the left hand side, and on the right a simple humble blue tit. But what a stunning bird, absolutely beautiful. It would be, if it were rare, you'd have twitchers from all over the world flocking in to see it, but it isn't. It's common or garden. We have them in our nest boxes, and they're very common in our garden, but they make a superb photograph. You've got maximum control as well. You've got complete control over background. The background can be a good distance away, and with the appropriate aperture, I think I've used about f5.6 on the long lens on this one. I've been able to drop the background beautifully out of focus. You can position your little hide wherever you want it, and as the bird's flying into the feeders, you can fire a burst of images off and capture the bird doing what it does. Many cameras these days have got pro capture type modes. If people are not familiar with those, I can explain them later. But essentially, it's a way of, with a half press of the shutter button, the camera recording into the buffer. And as you press the shutter button fully, it captures that. It's a bit like a time travel machine, really, because it captures that takeoff sequence with birds. So really, really useful. I use it for insects too, such as the shot on the right hand side. These were taken in my garden, both of them with a long telephoto lens, and I use two main lenses for this type of photography. I've got rather lazy with my macro or close-up photography over the years because I'm shooting with the OM gear. All the telephoto lenses all focus really close, and so 1200 millimeter field of view, with a or on a 600 mil equivalent lens, is enables you to stand, I don't know, something like 20 feet away from the subject. So on a warm day, butterflies like this can get really twitchy and really don't always allow a close approach. And so you can just stand back, camera on a little tripod, and wait for the butterflies to come into these buddleia bushes. Buddleia is brilliant for attracting butterflies and other pollinators. Another good tip and trick in your garden or backyard is to use a light trap for moths. A couple of things you need to be aware of here. Firstly, a light trap gives you the option, if it's a cool morning, to partake in some photography with the insects, the moths and other insects that have come into the ultraviolet light overnight, to perch them on perches of your choice. You don't tend to get this kind of thing in the you don't tend to find this kind of thing in the field. These moths I've got here, 3 of them are hawk moths, so they're night flying species generally. You might find them, you might be lucky enough to come across them perched up during the day, but very unlikely. This moth on the left hand side, it's called an angle shades, and it was found in our garden doing what these kinds of moths do, which is being camouflaged against a seed head. Something that you can do when you've got plenty of time. So I did that on this shot here of a head-on shot of an elephant hawk. About 30 images, and I was able to set this shot up so that I got everything in focus, and then was able to, by using a wideish aperture, drop the background beautifully out of focus. So complete control. And because you've got the subject in front of you, and hopefully it's not about to fly off, it does tend to depend a bit on the temperature, you've got a great subject for a few minutes while you photograph it. Just one little tip with light traps: be very careful that you do empty it at the end very carefully and put the moths in the undergrowth, because birds like nothing better than a free snack. And believe me, birds are real quick learners, and they do very quickly learn that every time you go and put your moth trap out, there's a free source of breakfast. Ponds, brilliant wildlife ponds. This is our pond in our garden that we reinvigorated a couple of years ago. And you know, I use this type of setup. It's almost like having your own outdoor studio for amphibians and particularly dragonflies. And as we work through the talk, I'll explain a little bit more about the kind of approach that I use for dragonfly photography, because I've done quite a lot of flight photography and that's quite specialist. But as you can see from this, it's a fairly small pond. It's nothing special. And there's a wildflower meadow behind it. You can see that drift of white there. Brilliant wildflower meadow, fantastic for attracting all sorts of pollinators. The pond is fantastic because it's been designed for me to shoot at more or less eye level, at water level, sorry. And we attract damselflies in addition to the dragons, and on the right day with no breeze, shots like this are possible. Reflection shots are brilliant for insects on a still pond. And on this one you can see we've got 3 pairs of azure damselflies mating, all dipping their bodies in the water and laying, and the water was so still that we've got a beautiful reflection of all 3 pairs. So no Photoshop on that one. I mentioned the meadow, brilliant for pollinators and spiders. This time of the year is great for spiders, dew-covered webs, highly photogenic, but lots of little flies and things on a cool morning, like the top one on the left-hand side there, just a common or garden, you know, ugly looking fly. But you get close with a macro lens, and this was taken with the newish now 90mm OM system macro at about f5.6 stacked. I think I tend to stack all my macro images now if there's not much wind. Obviously any wind is going to throw the sequence of shots out, so you do need a fairly calm day, and in that kind of position I'll take anywhere between 5 and maybe 15 or 20 stacked images. Little hoverfly on the right, and you know, you can, with time on your hands, and you can do this very, very easily. You don't need to spend very much time out there, maybe half an hour in the morning before breakfast or something like that. Now, I don't get these guys in my backyard. This is a red deer stag. I mentioned parks. Parks are another great place to start wildlife photography because generally they're within reach of people in urban areas. This is taken at Richmond Park in London, and Richmond Park is fantastic for red deer during the rut. This is a rutting red deer stag. It ticks all the boxes as far as composition is concerned, really. I've used a 500mm f4 lens on this one. This was taken with the full frame Canon back in the day at f4, so wide open to control depth of field. So it blows the background out nicely and allows me to soften that foreground. So really to concentrate the viewer's eye on the eye and the face of the stag. So the antlers are nicely in focus, the head is in focus, mid-roar, so great timing. The only thing this probably lacks a bit is if it had been taken a few hours before in the early morning, in the cool of the early morning, it would just have added a little bit more drama. These are parkland deer, but I've included the shots to illustrate a point. These are the hinds, and best not ignored. The hinds are not as photogenic, let's face it, as these big roaring stags, but they can be compelling, and the shots can be compelling. It's all about eye contact, isn't it? And this is true of human portraits just as much true of animal portraits. Get on eye level. Biggest mistake that I see as part of the judging work that I do for the Royal Photographic Society as part of their distinctions assessment team is we see people shooting looking down on their subject, and that does 2 things really. One, you lose your sense of eye contact and engagement with the subject, but B, you also get quite close to the background, and the consequence of that is that the background then becomes potentially intrusive in the image. And you'll see as we work through these images that I do like to keep my images really simple and clean and neat and try to focus the viewer's eye on the subject. I don't think there's anything wrong with having some context in the background, but you need to be in control of it. Also, the shot on the right, it's nice to show character, and this deer really does look as though she's having a great time having her tick specked out by this jackdaw, which is a common sight in Richmond. The only time when you want to think carefully about angle of view, and normally eye level view holds true for most wildlife, is when you really want to say something about the reflections on the water. And this is a great example. Beautiful gold, like liquid gold water in the evening on this tufted duck, or surrounding this tufted duck. And if I'd shot this at eye level, not that I could, but if I had, I would have lost that completely, and the background would have been very intrusive. So by just standing up instead of sitting down, and bearing in mind this is a parkland bird that was, very much used to people, I was able to bring those beautiful reflections into play. Same is true on this one to some extent. I wouldn't want to be too low on this because it would have brought intrusive trees into the frame. I wanted to say something about shutter speeds. I've mentioned that I'm going to be dipping in and out of different aspects of the technical and compositional and lighting elements of each image. So forgive me for that, but it would have been just, if I tried to deal with all that in detail, it would have been a series of lectures. I wanted to say something about shutter speed. One of the big mistakes that beginner wildlife photographers make is they don't use a fast enough shutter speed for birds in flight and for action sequences. This was taken with about 4,000th of a second shutter speed, and my sort of default on a bright day for birds in flight and birds moving generally is a high shutter speed like this. Wide-ish aperture, that's not critically important. I'll usually shoot wide open with the 150-400 lens, OM system lens. And I think if you've got a good lens that will take a wide open aperture, then absolutely use it, because it gives you that beautiful background control. But fast shutter speed is really important. Same is true on this swan. Swans are brilliant. You're going to find them in most parkland lakes, and certain times of the year during the mating season, when they're coming into the breeding season, the males get really quite aggressive, and they can be just fabulously photogenic, as this one shows, just showing a wonderful shower of water. The temptation is to get in a bit close. I think one of the things that I would perhaps do, again, if I was shooting this differently now, is just pull back a little. But in the excitement, sometimes you frame up, and it's easy to think later, could have, should have done that slightly differently. But still, quite an impactful image. Okay, so that's yeah. Go for it.
Sorry, mate. Just before you move on, we've got a question here from Mark Seymour.
Yes.
How do you meter for birds?
Okay. How do I meter for birds? Let's just go back to that. I'm an inherently lazy photographer, and I Mark, did you say?
Mark, yeah.
Mark, I'm an inherently lazy photographer, Mark, and I don't want to spend any time, if I can help it, thinking about the technical aspects of photography, other than making sure that my shutter speed is fast enough usually. So for this kind of photography, any kind of photography, my metering, I use a mirrorless camera. Obviously, I'm taking it that most people probably now use mirrorless, and I haven't used a DSLR since 2017, and so I have the histogram in my viewfinder, and I just keep an eye on my histogram, and I try to expose to the right. I don't want to blow the highlights out. This is a good example of an image where that's true, actually, because it would be very easy to overexpose the highlights and burn out the detail on the plumage of this swan. But actually, the detail is beautifully rendered. The whites are white, but there's still plenty of detail in there. And really, all I've done is metered off the bird and let the camera do the rest. Most of this is kind of, it's a manual setup. I know which shutter speed I want to use. I want to use a fast one. I know the aperture I want to use, as wide open as possible to render the background soft. The auto ISO is doing its thing. I might dab in, take a meter reading, perhaps as the bird is, in a fairly static position, dial in a little bit of negative exposure compensation to make sure I'm not blowing those highlights. And then, providing the light isn't changing, that exposure isn't going to change. I can just keep on blasting away.
So is it spot metering that you set it, or is it
No,
evaluate?
never. I haven't used spot metering for about, I think about
Yeah,
30 years, since I
yeah.
had my original OM2, and that was a film camera. No, I just use matrix metering, and I find it all absolutely works
That's like
well.
the default one.
Yeah, it's the default matrix metering. It's the default
Mm.
setting. It's the one probably that 95% of people use 95% of the time. I
Yeah.
can't think of an example these days where I'd use spot metering in
Mm.
wildlife photography. I mean, I can
Mm.
see why you might ask that question,
Mm.
because you'd think, well, are you spot metering off the bird's feathers? But one of the problems with putting a spot on is that, and I've done this before actually, trying to demonstrate to people, why you wouldn't do it. So I've put a spot on, played around with it, got distracted, and then gone back to meter something and found that the metering's all over the place. What's going on? It's because your spot has drifted off the subject and you're
Mm.
metering the background, say, which is dark, and all of a
Mm.
sudden the metering is completely off. So no, I leave it on matrix because I
Yeah.
find that it's so good these days that,
Yeah. It is,
providing you're not blowing the highlights, and you keep an eye on the histogram, which is your exposure meter, isn't it? Then
yeah.
that's cool. Does that
And
help, do you think?
yeah, I think that yeah, thanks. That was a great answer. And there's just Adrian Lynch there asking, evaluative is the same as matrix
Yeah,
on a
yeah.
Canon. On a Canon, yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
evaluative. Yeah, that's right. Canon.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, back those were the days. So I'm talking about wider farmland here, and woodland, heath, moorland, farmland, variety of species we can shoot. They're going to be more difficult to get close to. I think that's the real difference in shooting in your garden or a park, is that the animals and birds are going to be, if not habituated, at least more habituated than they would be if you were trying to photograph something like a roe deer in a cornfield, which is what this shot shows you. This is a roe deer doe. This was in the days when I was shooting Canon full frame, and I had my big heavy 500 f4 lens on a big Wimberley gimbal head and a monster carbon tripod. And I was out driving around, saw these guys right down at the far end of a field about 300 meters away. I thought, that would make they're in the field, they'd make a great, simple, clean image just while they're moving around and feeding on this farmer's crop. But how do you get there from one side of this field to another without these deer seeing me? Well, there was a line of trees that I could use to screen it, because even though you may have a silhouette, if your silhouette is against the skyline, they're going to see you straight away. But if you've got trees behind you, this is something I learned when I was a boy, when we were bird watching when I was about 6. The animals, providing you're slow and steady, really slow, then they're likely to not take very much notice of you. So bag hide on, camouflage bag hide. Don't know whether anybody here has ever tried using a bag hide with a tripod and walking with it. It's really, really hard. But, after about, I don't know, 30, 40 minutes of creeping along, trying to peer through the mesh hole with the lens sticking out, I managed to get within probably 60 meters of these guys and managed to fire off a few shots before they realized what this lump was and scarpered. But in the the intervening period, I did have this shot of a Rodo looking straight at the camera and looking up at me, which was what I was after. So I was pleased with that. But it does show you that concealment and patience are absolutely key. They're the watchwords, and this is something I referred to right at the beginning with field craft or field skills. These are the hardest things to learn. We can all watch YouTube videos of how to set your autofocus system up, how to set what shutter speed to use on a particular subject, but what takes years and years of practice is fieldcraft, learning how to get close to nervous wildlife, and doing it in a sufficiently reliable way that you don't spook them. They will eventually get spooked, if you get too close, as I proved on this occasion. But it's a really difficult thing to do. Even with insects, it can be hard. So shots like this, for example, this is a vixen fox and her cub that I was privileged to spend about 6 weeks shooting with a number of years ago. And the advantage of working with a single species or family group in this case for an extended period, is they got quite habituated to me. And even though these were wild foxes, the fact that I was working with them regularly and coming back and sitting in the same place each time, eventually the cub, the little chap on the right hand side, I assume it was a boy, we called him the naughty cub because he was always being told off by the mother, which is a behavior I wanted to capture. And this captures it perfectly. But they got very habituated to me, which made these sort of intimate portraits, even with I was probably sitting about 30 feet away, possible. And it can be very, very hard, obviously, if an animal is very nervous of you. But once they've accepted your presence and know you're there, which takes time, of course, you can get some very rewarding images. Now, I wanted to say something about woodland habitats, because woodland habitats have got their own specific fauna. Raptors such as this sparrowhawk on the right hand side, and these woodpeckers. This is a green woodpecker here, UK green woodpecker feeding its young. I would say that one of the things we talked about earlier was environmental impacts, and one of the problems we've seen more and more of, I think, particularly since COVID. There's nothing wrong with it, but more and more people are using the countryside and the wild environments to walk dogs and walk generally, and just find time and peace for themselves. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. And certainly in the UK, all our conservation agencies and wildlife trusts, they're all tasked with making the countryside more available to people, and that's a good thing broadly. But the problem with that is, for a wildlife photographer, it brings its own challenges, because it means you're not only having to contend with more people, but you're also having to contend with dogs. And I don't dislike dogs, but dogs from a photography point of view are a proverbial pain in the neck. The number of times that I've been trying to photograph something and a dog has blundered up and jumped over my shoulder and scared whatever it was I was photographing away. So if you can shoot on private sites, and this takes some negotiation and some research, but if you can shoot on private sites, you will be well rewarded, and well rewarded mainly by having the site to yourself. So well worth thinking about that. Now, I mentioned heathland and moorland, which is a habitat that we're lucky enough to have a reasonable amount of in the UK. And I've included these three shots. This is a Dartford warbler. It's a beautiful little warbler that is very much a specialist of these heathland sites. And three sort of classic poses in three different lighting scenarios here. On the left hand side, nice blue sky behind it, out of focus gorse bush, very diffuse. On the right hand side, in contrast, on a gorse bush, just angled downwards slightly to bring that gorse in the background, just out of focus, but into the frame as a bit of an environmental context, if you like, but still not intrusive enough to cause you a distraction. And on the center image, I'm making the most of the light by shooting against the light. Early morning, there was a beautiful bird singing on top of this gorse bush. You can see the thorns there, and just by positioning myself against the early morning sky, I was able to get a beautiful silhouette, and you can still see which species it is. It's got a very characteristic shape of the head. So make the most of the light. Really worth thinking about. Now, this is an interesting bird. For those of you who are not familiar with it, I'd never seen one close up before. This is a crossbill, a European crossbill, and it's a species of northern climates. Feeds on seed cones of conifers. You can see one of the seed cones dropping here during the middle of its feed. And I was photographing Dartford warblers actually on a local heathland site when a small flock of these guys flew in and landed on a tree near me. And I guess it just proves that, it goes to show you've got to be flexible, because it would have been very easy to have stayed completely fixated on the Dartfords, which were performing quite well on that morning. But I've never got decent photographs of a crossbill, and they're so unusual and odd. And you can see the bill here at the tip is, really, really well shown off. So I relocated slightly and spent a bit of time getting close to them, and I was able to get some shots that I was quite pleased with. So be flexible. So don't just slavishly photograph what you've come to photograph. If something else presents itself as another opportunity, then do think seriously about it. That said, don't get so distracted that you're off one subject and onto another and can't make up your mind what to photograph. We've all been there, believe me. We've all done that. This is another moorland bird, heathland bird, farmland bird, the linnet in the UK. It's quite a pretty bird, really, quite a nice russet brown with a sort of slaty head. And I've included this because this was taken from a vehicle. Many parts of the world using your vehicle as a hide is a really good idea. And even in the UK, it can be really handy. So I tend to drive, if I'm out driving from site to site, with my lens either on the seat beside me if I'm going slowly, and do be careful you don't brake hard, or in the footwell with the camera strap wrapped around the gear lever. Maybe also not a good idea. Perhaps I shouldn't be recommending that. Safety being the paramount watchword here, but have the camera handy is all I'm going to say. Use your vehicle as a hide. And if you do see something, coast up. I mean, many of us are lucky enough to have electric vehicles these days, or hybrids where you can go into, electric mode, and you can creep up very slowly, window down, lens out. You don't even need a beanbag these days. If you're worried, use a rolled up jacket or something like that, and then just coast into position very, very gently and slowly, move slowly, and you should be able to get some decent shots. Now, I wanted to talk about some threatened wildlife. In the UK, we've got one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, and I'm very conscious of the fact that birds like the cuckoo, which at one time when I was a boy actually were really very abundant across the whole of the country. And if you look at a distribution map of the way these birds their distribution has changed over the years, it's really alarming. In Devon, we really now only see them on the moorland. And they are an absolutely stunning bird. I mean, they've got the most extraordinary life cycle. Most people will know that cuckoos parasitize other birds. On the moorland here, they parasitize the little meadow pipits. And so I've always been keen to try to capture that interaction. And I've included these images because I think this is really interesting and really important. I say this to my students, that it's really important that once you've nailed down the basic technique and you've nailed down portraits, and portraits are not easy, decent portraits are not easy, despite what some photographers will tell you. A good portrait is still a very worthwhile thing to aspire to. If you use behavior and other elements, you can start to layer in different levels of interest. So, with good lighting, with a nice background, with great behavior, and essentially a portrait mixed in with it, you can really produce some impactful images. And these are meadow pipits trying to chase a male cuckoo away from its territory, because obviously they react like this too. Every time they see a cuckoo, they react like this. So that's really important, and you're not going to get close to birds like that, or indeed many of these other wildlife, unless you do your research. There's no point in looking in the wrong place, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. The more you become familiar with wildlife and the more wildlife photography you do, and the more you read, and the more you watch YouTube videos, and the more you become immersed and involved in it, you'll start to realize there's certain species that you really want to photograph, and you want to do your research in order to find them. So the dragonfly on the left hand side here, this is a golden ringed dragonfly, UK species, and it's a dragonfly of upland streams like this. This is a beautiful upland stream on Bodmin Moor in Cornwall in the southwest of the UK, adjacent to heathland, on which these amazing moths, the emperor moth, it's a big thing, but I don't know, 4 or 5 centimeters across, flutter across the moor in spring, in late April and early May, and they are the most exquisite looking insects, and completely improbable because the open moorland is not a place you'd expect to find something as odd as that. But you've got to look in the right place. So do your research and you will be amply rewarded. If you don't do your research, if you do what I did when I started wildlife photography, which is often aimlessly wander, you will get very frustrated and it will become harder and harder to motivate yourself. So that's kind of a variety of different habitats. One of the habitat types that we're sadly lacking in the UK now, other countries are going to be, are going to have far more of this than we do, is flower-rich meadows and scrub edge habitats. Brilliant habitat, that sort of interface between the scrub edge and the meadow communities. We don't have many wildflower meadows left, unfortunately. We've lost over 99% of them since the Second World War in the last 80 or so years, which is incredibly alarming and very sad, converted to agriculture. But they can be incredibly rewarding places to visit and to photograph, especially for butterflies. I was lucky enough a couple of months ago to be working in France, where I worked on a small rewilding project, where they've now got 66 species of butterfly, which is, for an 8-hectare site, is a remarkable number. All on the back of this little rewilding project, just a grazing animals doing what grazing animals do. This is a map butterfly on the right hand side, and one of the fritillaries, I think it's a meadow fritillary, on the left. A couple of things I want to say about composition on these two. The one on the left hand side, I was attracted really by this scabious plant. Just looked really graphic, and it seemed to really offset that a beautiful pristine insect just perched really beautifully on it, really well. It's a stacked image. I generally do my stacking in camera now, where a JPEG is spat out at the end. I usually use anywhere between 10 and 15 images if there's no wind, and there wasn't on that day. So a little tripod set up to frame everything up nicely, and then quickly fire a burst. Out of camera JPEG, job done. Image on the right, same thing, nil wind day, shooting against some trees in the background, but a lovely background, nice and out of focus with a fairly wide aperture. And I included this non-flowering scabious head on the left-hand side to give the image a degree of balance and a little bit more interest, and it works quite well with the wings of that stunning butterfly open there. This is in the UK. This is a fairly freshly emerged ringlet butterfly, another stunner. And this is composed in a particular way to make the most of this beautiful curve of this grass, which leads the eye in nicely to this insect here. And I've just used this grass here to cap the image and really, I guess, stop your eye following the stem up and leaving the frame. So but lovely light, so really making the most of the light, and tack sharp insect from tip of the antenna to tip of the wing. Don't forget the environment. It's very easy to get, and this is one of the other things that we see a lot in the assessment work that I do. It's very easy to get bogged down in, let's have that subject as big as possible in the frame. Hopefully you'll see by now that very few of my images have subject very large in the frame. The closer you get to your image, the bigger the image in the frame, I guess, the less of the story you're able to tell. Size and frame really matters. The smaller the insect, or in this case insects, or arachnids in the middle image, the spider, but the smaller the subject in the frame, the more information that the viewer has about the setting, the environmental setting, if you like. It's really exemplified on the right, where this little common blue is sitting on top of this beautiful orchid. So the orchid is just as much a part of the narrative there as the insect itself. So size and frame really does matter. Don't be tempted to just go right in and exclude everything else. Give your subject room to breathe. You've got a little bit of cropping headroom there as well if you need to do any work in post-processing. Some insects can be really, really hard to photograph, and I think the crickets are a particularly good example of that because of their extraordinarily long antennae. This is a speckled bush cricket, rather a beautiful sort of denizen of our grassland sort of edge communities, and this is sitting on a shrub leaf. This was taken in France at the same site, and you can see I've stacked this. There was no wind, and I did that in order to deliberately get the entire insect in focus, and it's in focus from the back of its legs here right to the tip of the antennae. It would have been very easy to have shot that lazily using a I don't know, f7.1, f8 depth of field, resultant depth of field from that kind of middling aperture, but I still would have had quite a large chunk of this insect out of focus, and I wanted everything to be in focus, but with the background just drifting away nicely. So yeah, that's often a consideration. One of the other things that I'm looking for, I mentioned really early on, looking to include aspects of behavior. I think it's really important to try to tell a story, to give a narrative, to give the viewer something to think about when they're looking at a subject. This is a labyrinth spider. So called because of the type of web it builds. It's a sort of, it is a labyrinth. We had one in the garden in a low shrub, and the web was over 1 meter, 3 foot wide, and with a tiny funnel in the middle, and the spider, where the spider lives, she'll come out, and in this case you can see she's just grabbed hold of a red ant. This is on a heathland site. And you can see, if you look closely, there's a whole litter of debris, of insect debris underneath here. Insect on the right, the arachnid on the right. This is a web spinning 4-spot orb weaver, which I photographed a few days ago, and I just was rather taken by her extraordinary sort of dance-like behaviour. She spun her web. You can just see the web, the silk coming out from her spinneret at the end of the abdomen there. Don't forget the larvae, little plea. Scrub habitats can be brilliant places to go and look for larvae in the late summer. This is an eyed hawk moth larvae, and it's on a willow leaf, and you can see it's doing its best impersonation of a leaf, just trying to impersonate the leaf, so presumably to avoid being eaten by a bird. And
it's amazing.
It is amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out which one it was.
Yeah, camouflage, insect camouflage is incredible. One of the things I mentioned about fieldcraft is that it's really hard to develop an eye. I worked with a guy years ago who I've just realised I'm running well behind, Mark. I hope that's okay.
Yes, fine.
I
People
like talking about photography too much, unfortunately, and ecology. I worked with a guy, and we were out looking for. We were doing monitoring work for particular species of dragonfly up on the moorland, and Paul was just the most amazingly observant guy, and I thought I was pretty good. But we were looking for these little larval exuvia, their larval cases, because that's where you establish population size for these insects. He was finding 10 times the number I could, no matter how hard I tried. I mean, I've got better at it, but I still miss stuff, and I know I'm missing stuff. But the more you practice, the better you get generally. So let's look at some coastal environments, because there's some good stuff going on here. The big guys on the coast are seals, aren't they? And again, all the same rules apply. Get down low, get on eye level, use a long lens. These guys are really vulnerable. This is a harbour seal, a common seal or harbour seal in the UK. They're actually fairly rare now, declining. You do not want to get close to them. You need to respect the wildlife. It's really, really important that in our enthusiasm for taking a photograph, that we don't put the wildlife that we're trying to photograph, and hopefully to show other people and help conserve them, that we don't put them in jeopardy by our enthusiasm for taking pictures, because we can do it's very easily to inadvertently do it. This was taken from a boat on a boat trip. This guy's asleep. This is what seals do. They do, it's called bottling, and they literally hang upside down in the water. Sorry, they hang right way up in the water with their heads above the water, and they just bob up and down asleep, and that is how they sleep. And I included this really because partly because I was taken with the beautiful color of the water, but partly because I wanted to plea, keep it simple. Think about your backgrounds. Think about what you're trying to tell the viewer. You can photograph the most mundane things, but if you've got an attractive but simple background and a bird or an animal or whatever, doing something that tells a story that gives the image some narrative, then that makes for a much more powerful image. Just the otter having a scratch, beautiful seaweed, shot with a Nikon. I apologize to all the Canon, Olympus, Sony, Fuji users. My dalliance with Nikon, but brief, superb kit actually it was, but I ended up back with OM. Taken with the D810, I think, and the 500 f5.6. Great combo actually, but heavy to lug across the wet, slippery, seaweed-covered rocks. I always used to think that photographing otters in a place like Mull or on the west coast of Scotland would be really easy, because this is where most of the shots of these animals are taken, right? In the UK at least, and they are easier to photograph than river otters in the UK, because they tend to not be nocturnal. So that's a bonus, isn't it? But they're really hard to get to, and they can be way out, at low tide, foraging in the rock pools, and you might have to travel 100 meters on your stomach through rock pools and across wet seaweed before you can get into a position close enough to photograph them. But amazing experience, and to see and photograph a wild otter, just be very cautious about disturbance. Now, look, I have to say, this is a turnstone. It is foraging along a beach, and I have to confess, this wasn't taken in the UK. This was taken in Tobago. While my wife and everybody else was sunbathing on the beach, I was watching these little guys bobbing up and down the beach, pecking amongst the seaweed. And so I was doing the photographer thing, trying to avoid the sun and lying down with my long lens that I'd taken with me and my camera, taking photographs at eye level of this beautiful bird. People thought I was completely bonkers, but hey, that's wildlife photography, isn't it? As I say, while everybody else was lying there with their martinis on the beach, soaking up the rays. So it was worth it. It was worth going. But the key thing is eye level. Now, I included this image partly because it's a coastal bird, black-headed gulls, very widespread. But more important, when you're photographing behavior, you need to do the Cartier-Bresson thing. The decisive moment is key. So this image could have been taken a split second before or a split second after, and it would not have worked. It works for the simple reason that everything is looking at that one bird that's coming into land. Yes, there's diagonals going on. The basics of composition, use diagonals if you can. It gives a sense of dynamism to an image. But the most important element within this image is the fact that these two birds in particular are looking at the one trying to land. It's as if to say, you're not coming into land here, there's not room. So that's a key, really. Decisive moment. We've all got cameras that will shoot at millions of pixels, millions of frames per second now. 120 frames per second is not uncommon with the latest gen of cameras. There's no excuse not to have a sequence where you can choose in post the best and most impactful moment. Okay, I mentioned otters. We're back to otters, but these are river otters in the UK. A once in a lifetime opportunity, and one you need luck for. Taken with a long lens, but this otter knew I was there. But we had the most remarkable thing a couple of years ago on a local river where a dog otter, this guy, was appearing on a regular basis, and people were able to stand on the banks photographing this guy or videoing this guy with their camera phones. Unbelievable. Never seen anything like it before. Eventually, this otter and one other were chased away by dogs. So, environmental reasons really why dogs off leashes in areas where there's sensitive wildlife is maybe not a good idea. But we were lucky enough to be able to get close up and personal with this. I was lying on the bank, semi in and out of the water, but got a really engaging portrait of an animal that's really, really hard to get close to in the UK, away from those coastal areas in Scotland. This is another one. I just made the use of a little bit of almost a waterfall, where you could lie a little bit lower than the water level and shoot across the top of the water to get that lovely eye level engagement. Or in fact, I'm just slightly below eye level, and you get that lovely bubbling water here. And as the otter popped up, fire a few shots off. I've got too many. This is one of those moments when your heart's beating fast and you're saying to yourself, you've got to get this right. You've really got to get this right, because if you don't get this right, you're going to be kicking yourself 5-10 years down the line. And fortunately, the autofocus worked, which was a relief. Wetlands, wetland birds, herons, brilliant. If you've got heronry near you, or storks or something like that, where they nest communally, brilliant to see. take-off shots like the image on the right-hand side. Use a fast shutter speed, guys. If you look closely, I haven't really got a large image here, but you can just see droplets of water flicking off this heron's foot as it's just taking off. And the image, when it's blown up, the larger image works partly because of that, partly because of the lovely complementary colors. There's a beautiful orange beak against the blue of the reflected early morning light on the water, and this lovely high bright individual against the dark background. That lovely low-key kind of feel to the image works really well too. But herons are great because although they can be skittish, particularly on places on lakes where there's a lot of people, they can allow you to get reasonably close. So definitely a great subject. As are grebes. Classic shot, bit boring. See these a lot, these kinds of shots, pairing up. These grebes pair for life, and they come together in spring and do this wonderful weed dance. It's nice to find something a little bit different angle of view. So really, really low angle of view. This bird was preening. It just popped up after having wetted its feathers, and it was just shaking its feathers out. So the light was quite interesting too, and it just kind of matches or complements these beautiful feathers on the face of the grebe, and a nice reflection on the water here, almost painterly sort of effect. Another bird which I keep meaning to photograph more of, and we're lucky enough in the UK to have a reasonable population in our reed beds now, is the reed bunting, or reed bunting, what am I talking about? The bearded tit, which is a bird of reed beds, or bearded reedling to use its correct scientific name. This is an image which has a very shallow depth of field. Really the only things in focus are the bill, the eyes, a little bit around the face, and the feet here with the reed seed head, perhaps a little bit of the reed there that's curving over to bring the eye into the frame, but everything else is out of focus, but not so out of focus that you don't know exactly what habitat this bird is in. And that's the key, really. I mentioned early on, it's all about controlling the background so that you can give a narrative to your viewer but not impose on them to the point where their eye is constantly distracted. And the image works, I think, because of that. The regular patterns in the reeds tell you something about it, but they're nicely out of focus. Now, with wetlands, obviously you're going to get dragonflies and damselflies. A few words about that before I move on to sort of final subject that I want to talk about. This is a banded demoiselle. It's a classic species of our lowland rivers, slow-moving rivers and streams. And this is what you might call a classic insect portrait. It's what a lot of people do when they're trying to perfect their technique early on in their career, as it were. And it's got everything about it that's spot on. It's got a beautiful out of focus background. There's a nice tonal transition between top and bottom. The perch is beautifully curved in and complements the insect. It's in focus. The whites are controlled. The insect is beautifully in focus. The wings are in focus. There's lots of lovely detail. So it's an absolute classic. But once you've done that kind of thing a lot, it's a bit Wikipedia. It's a good Wikipedia, but it's a bit Wikipedia. So I prefer to try at least for something a little bit different. I'm always looking for sparkly areas on, reflected light on streams where you can position yourself to get the insect almost in silhouette, which is what I've done here. This was actually a failed shot, I must add here, because I was actually trying to get a takeoff sequence of the insect, takeoff shot, and it just would not oblige. It sat there and sat there and sat there. Meanwhile, I was kind of sinking further off, slipping off my rock into the stream, getting a wet bum, and this insect just didn't cooperate. And then I moved to try to regain my position on this moss-covered rock, whereupon the damselfly flew off and never returned to its perch. Such is life. It's a project for next year, perhaps, but it just, I guess, it illustrates a key point, which is experiment. Don't be afraid to experiment. Nail your shot first, by all means, and try to achieve that sort of classic portrait of whatever it is you're photographing, and then explore. Move around the subject, explore different lighting scenarios, come back later in the day, go out earlier, etc., etc. Now, I wanted to finish on this subject because this to me is really important. This is a project, this is an article I wrote a few months ago for Outdoor Photographer magazine in the UK, and it was entitled The Power of Projects. And it's about how having a focus on a particular species or a particular group of species or a particular type of photography, whether it's flight photography or whatever, can really enhance your photography. And it might be, you know, a local woodland you want to focus on, or it might be bird feeders in your backyard, or it might be dragonflies in flight, or it might be a particular species of dragonfly. It can be anything, but it does mean you're absolutely focused. Now, just during COVID in 2020, I'm as an ecologist, I'm licensed to photograph and work with bats. And for years, I'd wanted to photograph bats in flight. And I was lucky enough during 2020 to be able to photograph bats, because we've got bat roost in the back garden in our woodshed, and I experimented there with an increasingly elaborate setup, because we had, let's face it, we didn't have anything else to do, and this is great. It suits my style of photography because it means I can set the system up. You can see here, this is a radio trigger, a flash trigger. There's a little rod there for me to focus on. Got a camera just out of frame here. These are all flash guns. And this is in a woodland with a little sort of wooded corridor where the bats were coming back to roost. And this is great because it enables me to go out after breakfast and collect all the gear in and see how few photographs I've got that work. But occasionally it does work well. And this is just one of the shots that I got from this particular site. This is a greater horseshoe bat, pin sharp, and our wings outspread as it's traveling down this sort of wooded corridor, breaking to turn and fly into its roost. So I was lucky to be able to do that. It does require a license to be able to fire a flash at a bat in its face, and I was working with the local wildlife trust who own this reserve and own the roost that these bats fly to and from, but unbelievably privileged to be able to do that. And if you go onto my website, onto the projects section, there's a section there on bats in flight. You can see some of the work that I've done, but that occupied me for about 2 years. So that was a one extreme. Another extreme would be work I do most years with dippers on a particular stretch of our local river. And this is a dipper. She or he has got food in the bill, taking him for young. And this was a nice low-key side lit shot, just almost spotlit really, with the bird almost being illuminated on this perch just before it flew off to feed its young. There's all sorts of ways of photographing these very beautiful little birds. They're not that much bigger than a sparrow. This almost the same size as the leaf here, but a very simple shot, just coming in on a couple of granite boulders, kind of giving me the eye, I think, maybe before she or he flew into the nest to line the nest. And on the left hand side, if you've got these birds near you, and they are widespread across the northern hemisphere, nest building going on here, but fairly slow shutter speed. 60th of a second has just given me some blur in the water there, which just adds a little bit of drama and interest to that particular portrait shot. So dippers are great if you can find a nest. I should say with all this, one of the problems with field work is that finding a good photogenic location to enable you, for example, to photograph shots like this, which is taken through a hole in a log to give that lovely sort of color blur around the outside, really focuses the eye down the tube to the bird. It can take a lot of work, and I'll come on to motivation in a minute, because it is a particular issue, I think, with wildlife photography. And another project that I've been involved with over the last couple of years, it was in the lead up to applying for my Royal Photographic Society fellowship, which, if you've not done one of their distinctions, absolutely highly recommended. I think they're an incredibly good way of focusing your photographic brain and working towards a task, providing you're reasonably thick-skinned and you don't mind some criticism. It's not about being right or wrong. It's about meeting a target. It's a bit like doing a pro shoot or sequence of pro shoots. But I wanted to get some images in my portfolio for my fellowship, which is 20 images of insects, or that was what I'd chosen to do, of dragonflies in flight. And with the advent of the OM1 and the higher ISO performance, better high ISO performance, I found that I got a camera finally that would enable me to do it, allied with the Pro Capture function, which I mentioned right at the beginning, which is when you put your finger half on the shutter button, you have a number of images. In this case, I think I'd got about 20 images being cycled into the camera buffer. As soon as the finger goes down on the shutter button, all those are captured. I could never, and I don't know any human who would be able to capture the takeoff sequence of a dragonfly. It's just too quick, happens too fast. The image on the right is a broad-body chaser leaving its perch. But of course, if I instantly press the shutter button as soon as a dragonfly moves, chances are I will have a takeoff sequence, and that's how I captured these images. Even with that, it's still very hard to get a really compelling shot. These shots were lined up very carefully, set up so that there's a nice clean background behind, beautiful perch. It's got to be a pristine insect. So there's still a lot of problems in getting this kind of work right, but it's still it was it was something that took a couple of years, but it was worthwhile. High shutter speed, I mentioned the high shutter speeds earlier, 16,000th of a second on the left, and I think 12,800th on the right. You need a fast shutter speed. I wanted to stop the action. Yeah, it would have been completely legit to have blurred wings, but if you can get sharp wings and show that exquisite detail on the new wings of a newly emerged dragonfly, why wouldn't you want to do it? It's a cop out, I think, to say, oh well, I like the wings blurred. Sometimes it works, but often to have those wings still like that and show the detail is really nice. Couple more. These are from this year. Now I'm trying to take that one step further and introduce some interesting lighting, such as the shot on the left-hand side, and also photograph more than one dragonfly in flight at the same time. And you would not believe how hard that is. This is the best I've done so far, with 2 dragonflies coming into the land on their perch. These are 4-spot chasers. And both of them are sharp. Both of them are coming. You can imagine, you've got, what are we working with? F7.1, a few millimeters depth of field. The chances of both of those insects being in the plane of focus, really minimal. I'm coming to the end now. I wanted to just, I think, sum up by saying that wildlife is hard to photograph in large part because humans are good at picking up pattern from the environment, but the environment can be overwhelmingly complex. And the art of good wildlife photography and the art of good wildlife photography composition is extracting order from that chaos. This is the mass roost RSPB ham wall on the Somerset Levels in the southwest of England. And it is absolutely barking mad in spring when literally tens of thousands of 4-spotted chasers all emerge at the same time and spend their time in the early morning roosting like this before they all take off. It's amazing. It's an amazing sight, but pulling order out of that is really hard. So maybe going for an abstract approach, a little bit like I've done here, where I've deliberately thrown the right hand side, the insect on the right, out of focus, but wanted to get some sense of the order by having these insects in focus here on the left. And I think that kind of sums it up, really. To me, wildlife photography is about finding order in that chaos. And if you can do that, then you'll be well on your way to making progress with it. So let's sum up really by saying a few things that I wish I'd known when I started. I wish somebody had told me this. That fieldcraft was going to take years to learn, even though I was an ecologist and I was familiar with a lot of these species and their ecology. Getting close to them and learning to photograph them well isn't easy. I recommend a book by a good friend of mine called Paul Hobson, about wildlife photography tips and field techniques. Essentially, it is absolutely brilliant. I don't know of another book like it. I'm sure Paul won't mind me plugging his book, and if you can find it online, fantastic. If you can't, contact me. I'll see if he's got a few old copies. It is brilliant and well worth a read. Be familiar with your equipment. You don't want to be fumbling around trying to remember where your back button focus is, or how to adjust your shutter speed in the middle of photographing an otter on a river when you've only ever seen it once and you know you'll never see it again. So become familiar with your equipment. Study composition, develop a repertoire. And what I mean by that is have a series of, by studying composition, you'll end up with a series of templates, if you like, in your brain, so that when you're put in front of that otter on a river that you're never going to see again, you will have a really good idea of how to compose an image so that it's compelling. And study composition, study the old masters, study art, study, there's a reason why we compose in a particular way. Artists have been doing it for thousands of years. Understand it and spend time doing it. The 5 Ps. What are the 5 Ps? I hear you cry. I could have had 6, but prior planning prevents poor performance. Absolutely. I did it the other day. I went out, I got, my bag, put it in the back of the car, beautiful misty morning, gone out to photograph spiders, got there, found a really nice spider on a beautiful glistening web backlit with the sun, got the camera set up, got the tripod set up for a little stack, turned the camera on, no battery. Everybody's done it. I know everybody's done it, and I tell everybody not to do it.
Good to know it still happens, even
It's
with all your years' experience. It still happens.
I can't tell you. I was about half an hour from home. I can't tell you what the language was like. I called myself some names, I can tell you. So you need to be patient with yourself as much as anything. You need to be persistent, because you will very often come back having photographed nothing. Wildlife is unpredictable. This isn't like a studio shoot of a model that you're paying. Projects will give you focus. I absolutely recommend it. Distinctions through the RPS, brilliant way of giving you additional focus. And don't forget your post-processing. We haven't really talked about that, but it's really important that you learn to make the most of your images. And finally, consider your environmental impact. Do read this if you get the chance, the Nature Photographer's Code of Practice. You can find this by Googling it online, because this really sums it up for me. There's a hard and fast rule. The welfare of the subject is more important than the photograph. So if in doubt about anything, about whether you're having a negative effect, walk away. And on that note, Mark, I think, and everybody for listening, thank you for listening. I hope you feel you've learned something and I've not rambled too much, but that, as they say, is the end.
That was fantastic. We've got questions. I'm going to, everyone that's typed questions in, don't go away anywhere, because we're going to come to them in a minute. But Andrew, some fabulous photography there. Absolutely stunning. And thank you for showing it to us. It's been a really good presentation. Really good.
Thank you.
And thanks. Right. So listen, we've got some questions, right?
Yep.
For everyone else, you're about 30 seconds behind when you start typing in, just so that you know. But we've got some that's already been typed in. I've just got to now find them. I'll just go for a very quick one. Stu Hampton, I think I can't find it. He was saying, does the OM1 have IBIS? Just
yes.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. I think with most mirrorless cameras these days seem to have IBIS, don't they? And it works in tandem with the lenses. Easy.
That was there we go. I found it. Sorry, what it does is, because I'm looking, because these questions are they're up there. So just bear with me, everyone. I will get to you. Right, just bear with me. Right, I've got one here from Tony Cox here, and what he says is, I have today taken a delivery of a Canon EF 100-400 lens. A couple of questions. I use a Canon full frame and a Canon crop sensor cameras. My questions are, will I get a greater focal length when using the crop sensor body? And what are your views about using a 1.4 times extender on the full frame body?
Yeah, I can answer that, because that's exactly the same lens that I had back in the day with my Canon 1D Mark IV full frame, and I've also had the Canon crop sensor cameras, the 7D, I think, back in the day. So I've used both. No, you don't get a greater focal length, is the first point with a crop sensor body, but what you do get is a crop. So you get apparently greater focal length. It will make you feel closer, but you get less pixels on your subject, really. I mean, I have a OM system gear, micro four thirds. It's a 2x crop rather than the Canon's, 1.6 crop. So I've got a lower, I've got an apparently greater focal length. So I just relate it to full frame equivalent. So I've got a 400mm lens, but it's like looking at through an 800mm lens on a full frame. I would definitely use an extender. Absolutely. You will be losing a little bit of speed though with that lens. You'll be, I think it's a 4.5 to 5.6, I think. The 100-400, I think. So you'll be working at 6.3, I think your fastest aperture would be, with a 1.4 extender. But to be honest with you, most cameras these days, they're so good at operating at high ISOs that, and of course we've also got really good noise reduction software capability with things like Topaz and DxO Pure Raw, and even in Lightroom you've got really good noise reduction. So I really wouldn't worry about working at f6.3. Use what you need to get close to your wildlife, and if you need to push the ISO up and work on it in post-processing, better to do that than not have an image.
Good. Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks, Tony, for that question. One here from Chris Pascoe. Do you find access a problem in the UK?
Yes and no. There's never a simple answer. Yeah, access can be a problem. There are sites that I'd like to be able to photograph, and I know that there are potentially photogenic subjects there, but I can't get access. One of the biggest problem I find though is just the sheer number of visitors and the number of visitors with dogs these days, to be honest, in the UK. I think it's a particular UK issue. I'll be honest. I think if you were in the backwoods America, it would be, you wouldn't see many people during the day. But I think in the UK it's now becoming such a problem in that we've got a right to roam law in the UK, so all our moorlands are theoretically open to public access, and it's hard to get away from people. I think the days when you'd set a hide up in the middle of nowhere, they're long gone here. But there are sites, as I say, where access is an issue, and you can't get access to sites. But should we be able to? Actually, sometimes it's nice to leave the wildlife to do their own thing and have a bit of peace and quiet, isn't it?
Yeah. Right. I mean, do you think we're just getting too full up? Like these beautiful places don't multiply, do they? But we do.
We do actually, Mark. That's a really good point. I think there are too many people using them, and I mean I despair of it really, because a lot of the nature reserves that I frequent for everything from insects to birds, I just find that dogs can be a real difficult thing for photographers, because A, they disturb the wildlife, B, they're usually off leads, and C, people these days don't seem to really respond well if you ask them politely to please put their dog on a lead, or stop it jumping up at you with your expensive camera. And I've had situations where I've been photographing dippers on rivers with public access, and I've been sitting there hunkered down below the level of the bank, and I've been photographing a dipper on a rock, and all of a sudden a Labrador, and it's always a Labrador, has hurtled over my shoulder into the river. I've got this thing, I call it the Labrador index, and it's you can tell how busy a site is by giving it a rating on the Labrador index.
Yes.
Anyway, I digress. Yeah, it can be a problem sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thanks for that, Chris. There's another one I'm trying to find from Pete Wallace, if I can find it. Pete, I'm coming to you. I'm gonna lose it now. Oh, God blimey! This is because there's been loads of comments as they've come through, as you've been.
I know.
What did he ask? Right, okay, I'll remember it, because it's so. Pete, I know you've got. He's basically asked, is there any disadvantage? I found it. It's right there. Are there any disadvantages of using auto ISO? Are there disadvantages of using auto ISO?
Well, I suppose the first obvious disadvantage is you could inadvertently find yourself shooting at 107,000 ISO, couldn't you, or whatever. Generally speaking, I mean, I never used auto ISO for a long time with the OM gear, and that was the big disadvantage of the system for me. Because I felt that above 1600 ISO, 1600, yeah, 1600 ISO, I felt the camera performed, the images were not brilliant. You started to, you just really started to have issues with tonal control, and so I didn't use it. But when the IM1 came out, I found I could happily use ISOs up to, well, 10,000 plus, really, and I don't really have a major issue.
Is it that
noise.
good on there then?
Well, I think it's not that the ISO is great. Or the ISO performance is great, and I think there's a misnomer when it came out. People said, "Oh, well, it doesn't seem much better than the previous generation." But the important point for me was it retains detail at high ISO. Because look, we've got all these fantastic tools, haven't we, for noise control now? So if you shoot at 8,000, I'm not saying that I would do that out of choice. Of course, I wouldn't. I'd ideally like to shoot at low ISO. But if you've got an image which 8,000 is full of detail, then with good noise reduction tool, you've got a very usable image. And let's face it, unless you're a person that prints out big for the wall, most of us are printing thumbnail size for Insta, aren't we? And I mean, it's a platform I hate for that reason, because why would you want to look at an image that's an inch and a half long? It's just madness. But if that's all you're doing with your photography, then it makes not a scrap of difference. So for me, I use auto ISO with most of my wildlife photography because I'm a lazy photographer, and I just keep one eye on it in the viewfinder. We're using mirrorless cameras where it's what you see is what you get, and you can keep an eye on it. And if you're shooting in really low light, then maybe you want to switch into manual and be a bit more thoughtful about it. But for 90% of situations, you're going to be shooting in good light, aren't you? That's what photography is all about, really. So, it's not really, I don't think. I like to have some control now and again, but generally, I think there's few disadvantages.
Yeah. And you've also got, with experience, you've also got an understanding of roughly what your ISO is going to be hitting, don't you?
Exactly.
Do you know what I mean? With the light and the
right.
shadow.
Exactly
Right. There's John here. This was after the fox's photograph. Please, can you let us know how you approach depth of field for wildlife?
Good point.
It is one area that I sometimes struggle with to ensure that the subject is entirely in focus.
Okay. Again, I'm going to say that horrible D word. It depends. If you're shooting macro, then we've got the ability now with in-camera focus stacking, so that depth of field really doesn't become an issue. And in any case, with macro, usually you're working in a much more slow and controlled environment. I think you refer specifically, John, to the foxes. For that type of wildlife photography where you're photographing mammals or birds or something like that, I'm usually shooting wide open. And the reason for that is because I want some good control over the background. I'd rather have a shallow depth of field and struggle maybe to get the image absolutely in pin sharp focus where I want it, and I'll come on to that in a sec, rather than risk having an intrusive background by stopping down. And the problem is that when you're working close-ish to wildlife, you're right, the depth of field can be really shallow with a long lens. You could be looking at less than half a centimeter or something like that. If you get that AF point on the nose of a fox and it's looking at you, the eyes are going to be out of focus. Generally speaking, get the eyes in focus and everything else can be out of focus and the image will still work. You may be in that fortunate position where the subject is so isolated from the background that you can afford to stop down a little. So you can with a full frame camera stop down from say f4 to f5.6 or 6.3 and get that little bit of extra depth of field and get the nose in focus as well as the eye, so you get that that all of that rather than just the eye. Because although just the eye can look fine, it's quite annoying when the nose is out of focus. And of course, the bigger the animal, the more distance you've got to try to capture within your depth of field. So you may need to make compromises. It depends really on what you want to say in terms of your composition, I think. And I think every situation is different. And, what you learn, and I mentioned it right at the end, it's about studying composition and learning a repertoire and having all these it's kind of like having slides in a slideshow that whiz through your brain when you're sitting looking through the viewfinder, and that one of them will stop and you go, yeah, I know what I need to do now, and you dial in what you need, and then you get the shot you want. Doesn't always work, sometimes you get the wrong slide. Happens a lot as I get older, but generally speaking, the more you shoot and the more you do it, the more you'll realize what works and what doesn't. And I would say that it's you say you sometimes struggle. It's one of the reasons why wildlife photography is so frustrating, and it's so easy to get disillusioned with it, because very often you can come back, look at your images in post and think, these are really disappointing. Why aren't I better? I listen to all this stuff online and I read all the books, but it still ain't working. Well, it's because it takes years. I mean, I've been doing this for 50 years. I was really just bored. It's a long time, and 20 years of wildlife photography, and I still get it wrong.
Yeah, I think because I get to speak to lots of different photographers and see them do lots of different things, and I would say that wildlife photography is the one that needs the most commitment. Really, it's definitely the one that takes the most time, most commitment to get to get them real portfolio type shots. And
absolutely.
And you can watch a million YouTube videos, but when you're out doing it, that's when you're going to learn.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why I started the talk saying shoot locally, because not only does that minimize your environmental footprint, and we should all be cognizant of that these days, because wildlife photographers are terrible at saying that they're photographing wildlife to highlight the plight of wildlife around the planet. Well, we're busy destroying it by bombarding all these poor creatures, with surrounding them with photographers and traveling to the far ends of the earth, racking up this massive carbon footprint by traveling all over the globe to do it. So work locally for that reason, but the other reason is because it enables you to maximize your time. And let's face it, I mean, I don't get much time to do this. We have family commitments and everything else, and I might only get an hour or 2 hours. And if you're working locally, you can really make the most of that. That's that precious time, because it's time that's the key, and then you can practice.
Yeah, that's it. Right, I've got another one here. This is not so much a question, maybe a statement, but I think it's something that we should address.
I love it.
Yeah,
sounds like a university question.
That's right. Yeah, it's depressing to hear that these photos can only be taken with the latest high technology cameras. It's diluting the skill of a photographer. Discuss now. When
really
this question,
isn't it?
Yeah,
I love these.
That's right. But when this question came up by Simon, it was during the time when you was talking about the dragonflies in flight, and that you couldn't get them pictures before the new technology with the pro capture and blah blah blah. So I kind of gets what he's saying, but you don't need that to get like that. Well, let's discuss it. Go on, I'll let you go.
Let me discuss. Yeah, I'll write an essay, Simon. Give me your email and I'll write you an essay on it. It is, I suppose, is it diluting the skill of the photographer? No, I think it's a different skill. I think that what gave me the ability to take those kinds of photographs was the pro capture function of the cameras, which other manufacturers are only just starting to catch up with now. It's a function we've had for quite some time, and for birds it was, it's been something we've been using for 7 or 8 years, so it's hardly the latest technology. The thing that really switched me on to doing it for dragonflies was the ISO performance. And let's face it, virtually all the wildlife photographs that we see now are taken with high tech gear, aren't they? I mean, a digital camera is high tech. It was unheard. I started taking pictures of I started using a digital camera when 4 megapixels was considered to be really, wow, it was amazing.
Yeah.
But the reality is that
fortune on a 6 megapixel Canon. I spent an absolute fortune on that. It was like the top one at the time, and it was 6 megapixels.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reality is that this technology, AI, is going to change things yet again. But I think Simon's question really is about, is it diluting the skill of the photographer? And my answer would be no. It just means that with knowledge, passion, commitment, time, and knowledge of your subject and knowledge of what the camera can do, and you've obviously got to set the camera up right to make it, to get the images you want. You can get images that you couldn't get before. And then what will happen is we'll end up with different technology, and you'll be able to get other images which we can't take now.
Well,
and so
that's
it will keep on going on.
That's exactly what you did with that new technology. You didn't go out and take pictures that you was taking 5 years ago or whatever. You went out and made a specific point to use that technology to get a picture that you couldn't have got before. And
I would say one thing, Mark. Let me say one thing before I forget it. Simon, it's really important to understand that you don't need Pro Capture to take pictures of dragonflies in flight. You can, the image on the right hand side, I showed you those two images, one of the takeoff shot and the other one of a dragonfly coming in. The one on the right wasn't taken with the Pro Capture function. It was taken just with a fast burst. And really it was, I don't think I can go back through it easily.
That's right. That's right. Don't worry.
It wasn't that one. No, that's a takeoff shot. So it was the one of a dragonfly coming in, and I teach. Not all my students turn up to my workshops or one-to-ones with cameras that will have that Pro Capture function, but they still want to take pictures of dragonflies in flight. So what I get them to do is to spend a lot of time observing what the dragonflies are doing. And dragonflies, some species, are quite habitual, and they come back into the same perch time and time again. If you get yourself lined up in the right way, and you can plot that path, that flight path, and you can pre-focus manually on the perch, because I was using manual focus, you take a sequence of shots as the insect comes in, and you only need a fast burst camera system. And let's face it, pretty much all the cameras that people watching this will all take a fast burst. Anybody can do that. You just need a camera that's capable of shooting at, 6,400th in bright light, ISO 6,400, sorry, in bright light, and be prepared to do some noise control. So it isn't really necessarily the highest tech. So no.
Yeah, it enables you to do new stuff, but you don't need it. You don't need it. Certainly don't need it. Right. I don't think. Right. Listen, that is it. I know there's loads of people here that are, I'm just going to put a few up. That we've already said that one already.
Yeah, we said that.
Great talk here. Fantastic session. Thank you, Andrew. There's another one here. Thanks, Tony. Thank you. Right, loads of people have just wrote in. Thank you, and I think we're going to end it there because
excellent.
That was absolutely fabulous.
Glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, and sorry, don't go anywhere, everybody, because I'm just going to put something up on the screen. Right, don't forget that's where you find Andrew if you want to follow him.
Yeah, really boring. Andrew McCarthy Photography. There's an Instagram and Facebook links on my website. So if you only remember one, just remember the website, my name.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway,
yeah.
Mark,
just type into Google Andrew McCarthy Photography, which is what I did earlier to get these details. So there you go. It worked. But listen, thanks. You just stay there a sec, Andrew. I'm going to just end it for everybody else and say thanks again for tuning in. I hope you've really enjoyed it. I hope you've learned a lot. And I'll see you in the next one. So see you later.
Cheers, guys.